Hello and welcome back to the Bible Project podcast. And we're launching off together today and looking at the actual text of Genesis chapter 9, covering the opening verses. And I've called today's message God's Natural Order of Things. And I'd remind you that the transcripts to all these podcasts is always available in the episode notes section of any audio version of the podcast. Now, this opening section of Genesis chapter 9 that we're going to look at over the next couple of days can be divided basically into two parts. And we're going to look at the first of those today. And the first thing God does in these opening verses of chapter 9 is He gives some rules pertaining to what the natural order of things should be like. Then in the second part of the passage, He will make a promise. Now, at this point in the narrative of Genesis, and in the flood in particular, the waters have receded and the ark is now empty. The animals have begun to scatter over all the earth. God at this point reminds us of a subject He first disclosed back in Genesis chapter 1. You may remember when God created Adam and Eve, it tells us in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28 that God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Now in chapter 9 He repeats that ordinance, but listen carefully because He doesn't quite repeat all of it. Genesis 9 verse 1 says, "Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the earth." That's the end. The only part He repeats is the first part about being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth. God does not repeat the phrase to subdue it. So it seems humanity will no longer have complete dominion and rule over the earth. So the question is, why doesn't God repeat the whole original phrase? Has something changed? You see, it appears that the fall of humanity, with sin entering into the garden, has affected the original intent God had. It appears that after the flood, humanity is no longer able to subdue the earth and have dominion over the earth in quite the same way as He did when Adam and Eve were around before the fall. Some theologians suggest that this draws attention to the fact that Satan now has dominion over the earth, and that humanity will not have the same level of control again until Jesus returns. It now seems toil will be needed, but perhaps also a level of responsibility and cooperation with the created order will be a need to allow the earth to flourish. But in the meantime, this text is telling us humanity is to continue to populate the earth and to be fruitful and multiply. The second thing is explained in verses 2 and 3, which says this: "The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and on all the birds in the sky, and on every living creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything." So now we see every moving thing that lives can be food for humanity. Now that's different from what's before. The second thing He's doing here is making provision to enable humanity to move out, expand, and to fill and populate the whole earth. He not only tells Noah and his sons and his family to populate the earth, but He also tells them that He's provided animals for food in order to sustain human life and that population growth upon the earth. Now you may remember God said to Adam already in chapter 1, "See, I have given to you of every herb and seed which is on the face of the earth. Every tree that has fruit you can see and use, it shall be your food." But notice nothing was said about meat in chapter 1. Now some people actually use this chapter 1 in isolation to suggest that God intended for us to be vegetarians and that we should never eat meat. And it is true that nothing is said about eating meat in any way at all prior to this chapter 9. But here God is seen to give human beings explicit permission to eat meat. In this passage, God says to Noah, "You can eat all forms of meat. I give you all the animals, all the birds and the fish." So at this point, God is clearly explicitly allowing the eating of animals for food. So there's a new provision being allowed for by God. But alongside that new provision comes a new prohibition. Verse 4 tells us this: "But you must not eat meat that still has its lifeblood in it. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being." So in verse 4 it says you can eat the flesh, but not the blood. The idea that is being represented here is about the blood. The idea here is the idea that life is represented in the blood. So the point being made here is that all life is valuable, and all life needs to be respected. But contained within the idea is the perspective that we should respect and enable all life of all kinds to flourish on the earth. So how we flourish by farming and breeding and eating meat should be done in a way that is respectful and sustainable to all life upon the earth. But there's one more principle at work here, and we'll take a look at that next time. Okay everyone, that's it for this time. Thank you for joining me. Now the place to go to connect to this and any other ministries I'm involved in is the podcast notes section of the audio podcast on the Buzzsprout website, or by looking in the episode notes section on whatever app provider you use. Within that you'll not only find the transcript of each talk, but you'll also find links to all the ministries and the way to connect with us, including the Facebook page, my YouTube channel, and links both to this, the daily podcast, and the Living in Faith Everyday podcast, which is a weekly roundup of all the various Bible study and talks that I'm doing over the period of the preceding week. You'll also find links there to my SoundCloud and my Bandcamp page, where I create the background music and the sound design of these broadcasts. But with that, all I'd like to say is thank you for joining me, and I hope to join with you again very soon.